In this chapter, the author discusses the implementation of programs and performance measurement. Basically, the implementation of programs is the implementation or execution of the budget. Performance is another issue, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in the next slides. The author talks about implementation being essentially the same as the execution of the budget through the programs and operations of the government. I think that's essentially true. There are interesting concerns when you get to the issue of performance. With respect to execution of the laws, remember that each budget at the state level, local level, and federal level is in fact a law. It is passed in the same format and is a statute. It's important to remember that when you are thinking about government budgets and one of their distinctions or differences between nonprofit and private sector company budgets. The author talks about essentially performance measurement. How do you measure the performance of a government program? It says, well, you compare the results with goals, but then says the goals evolve through the implementation process. Therefore, you have a circular logic, which is not making much sense. In my experience, the goals, etc., expectations, whatever you'd like to call them, are set in the legislation. In other words, if you read congressional legislation or state legislation or even city council legislation, what you'll find is that in the discussions and in the actual text of the bills, etc., you will find expectations. What is this supposed to do? Now, they are often very general because laws tend to be very general. EPA is supposed to make the environment better. I mean, it's very, very general exactly what they do. So you then have an administrative process which interacts with special interest groups and other agencies frequently and with the legislative authority to develop these standards or measurements, if you will. The author says that efficiency is balanced with accountability, and I don't think that's quite right. And the reason I say that is efficiency is an economic way of looking at businesses. Do you produce pens or cars or whatever it is that are of a level of quality that's acceptable to sale at a reasonable price? Are you efficient and do you make profit doing that? But in government, equity is a great deal more important. In other words, are we treating all citizens equally is much more important than efficiency. Accountability may get at that. However, accountability is really, in my view, a question of, are you implementing in such a way that is consistent with the legislative authority's intent and the community's desires? That's accountability. However, I don't believe that's a direct trade-off with efficiency. I think the trade-off with efficiency is equity. The author lists several what he calls problems of performance. I think uncertainty pervades the situation, and often it's a question of definitions. For instance, I was involved in the Oregon State strategic planning process. When we asked people in these large town halls that we had, how many people want to have, the children get a good education? We got almost 100%. However, when you then asked what constitutes a good education, in other words, what should a high school senior person graduating be able to do calculus, speak a foreign language, play football, play a violin, then you start getting all these diverse ideas. One of the difficulties is that in order to get legislation passed, it tends to be very general, and people's individual expectations tend to be very specific. So you have a built-in tension in terms of what are the program goals, how are we defining these things, and then the process of how do you measure that. Another difficulty that I don't think the author deals with quite the way we should, or as extensively as we might think about it, is the question of time. If you have a project to improve education, you're really not going to know until year 12. Well, that's a whole lot of election cycles and a whole lot of budget cycles down the road, and that's not really adequate to the organization and institutional needs. So you have difficulties measurement there. I think that that those are the major things, in addition to some of the things the author talks about. The author discusses this, what he calls interweaving through federalism, and the sort of shorthand for something like this is called principal agent theory. In other words, you have an agent, someone you pay to do something, and you don't have their expertise. You don't have their frontline knowledge. You don't have their particular expertise. So, for instance, you hire someone to teach French at the high school. You don't speak French as well as they do, and you're not a trained teacher. So you have what's called an agency problem, a principal agent problem. You have certain outcomes and goals that you'd like to see, but they tend to shape those things. This is very true with all of the activities in which governments, either to subordinate governments or to private sector or nonprofit agencies, try to have that work done by them, because there are definitional issues and differences in the incentives that are created for the agents that may be different from what the principals had in mind, which is why these ideas of luring action or getting people to do things because you give them incentives can fall apart, because you don't know how the agent, the people you want to have do these things, perceive that incentive. Regulation and its difficulties flows from the principal agent theory I mentioned in the prior slide. The problem is that you have a difficult time defining exactly what you expect in terms of an outcome. So as a grants officer, I had certain parameters that I pushed out to the grantees. We tried to publish a notice of grant funding availability, etc., to specify what we wanted. However, how that was interpreted could be very different. So when you have this idea that you try to sanction them in one program by for something they failed to do in another, it's difficult to do, because you get into areas that are extremely touchy in terms of governmental relations, in addition to the problems of preemption and those kinds of things that the author discusses pretty well. And finally, there's this idea of mandates. Mandates can be in the form of regulations, they can be in the form of grant terms, they can be in the form of secondary issues. So, for instance, the federal government wanted all the states, to raise their legal drinking age to 21. In order to do that, they said, if you didn't do that, we're going to cut off your federal highway funds. Now, if I did that to you, you'd call it blackmail. But since the federal government did it, they get to do it. The same thing happened decades ago when they wanted a national 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. They essentially told the states to voluntarily adopt a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, or they would cut off their federal highway funds. This does not create good feelings between the levels of government, as you can imagine. As a contracting officer's technical representative in the federal service, and some of the advantages that the author lists are accurate. Contractors go away, so you don't have body counts and that sort of thing, and the contracting process itself is so convoluted that I'm not sure if you actually reduce any red tape. And in my experience at Commerce, there were contractors who had held the same technically competitive contracts for decades, because once they had insinuated themselves in, they created situations that made it difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of them. The author does a pretty good discussion of the problems with contracting. I would only add that what I alluded to before is the idea of contractors becoming attached uh, is more common than my reading of the author's text would give you to believe. For instance, NOAA has a financial management and payroll and budgeting package that is used by all of Commerce. It provides that service to the entire Commerce Department. However, no federal employee, no NOAA employee or any other federal employee even has the password to get it into the system because it is run by a contracting organization which has had that contract for at least, well, 10 years now, perhaps a little longer. I also saw smaller contracts where the performance accountability report was contracted to the same individual for almost, well, as long as it had been in existence, and there was no federal employee that even had the password to open the PDF file. So problems with contracting, yes, they're listed in the text are accurate, but there are a lot of others that can be much more serious. Implementation is a serious problem, and I think part of the reason is that no government employees really have sufficient experience in indirect supervision that is characteristic, certainly, of the needs in these roles, whether it's with subordinate governments, private entities, or nonprofits. Fact of the matter is, you have some serious training and experiential issues, as well as some, what do you want to call, government culture issues that really, in my experience, most of the folks who do this work, grants officials, grants officers, and others, really don't do very well because they simply don't know how, they don't get very little training on it, and certainly the government environment is not conducive to that sort of thing. Performance management and reporting is one of the most, in my view, gamed things that government does. I mean, you can get citizen feedback. However, the people who are receiving the benefits of a program are much more interested in reporting good things going on, and they tend to be a lot louder and more consistent. With respect to program evaluation, doing randomized trials is very, very difficult. And the reason is that it's very difficult to go to an otherwise eligible entity, city, county, group of citizens, and say, you guys are in the control group, so you're not getting any of the benefits of this program that Congress passed, because we want to see what happens to you while we give the benefits to these others. The other difficulty is that all of the cultures of the various states are very, very different in terms of how they act and how they interact with these kinds of things. So it's very difficult to get sort of an even playing field on which to measure, if you will. So-called results-based management systems, really the question revolves not so much around the complexity or analytical capacity of the system, but rather the definitions of what constitutes performance. And that's where the rubber meets the road. Government has a very difficult time doing that because the question of what is a good outcome in this program is normative. My perception of that may be radically different than yours. And this is true of different interest groups. Therefore, you have contention within government, and you get sort of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, that all the children are above average. And that is why performance management, performance measurement in government, in my opinion, is so problematic. Interested to see that they use the CityStat Baltimore measurements and the CompStat crime reports. If any of you have ever had a chance to view the television program The Wire, you'll see what is actually a pretty dramatic and realistic representation of these Comstat meetings. People basically game the system. I mean, the question becomes, did you do what you say you're going to do? No one wants to have a bad evaluation, and so they, in the first case, as you try to implement measures, they want to have measures they can meet, and the second, administratively feasible measures tend to be anecdotal, and that becomes a problem. The other problem is that you need to understand what you measure. Once I went to visit a small business incubator that had no jobs and no private investment, which were the two metrics, at the 6-year mark when we measured it. It had been in business, we had 3 years, measurements looked good, the 6-year measurements were 0, because the two companies that had occupied the whole place at about year 5.5 had IPOs and were extremely successful, but at the moment we measured, there were no jobs in private investment because they were remodeling for new clients. That wasn't failure, that was success, but it looked like failure based on our metrics. So it's very, very tricky, very, very difficult to get good measures, even if you can agree on what the outcomes are. I think that every author, including our current author, wants to invent a word since Herbert Simon invented satisficing. Interwovenness, I don't know what's this all supposed to mean, but the problems that exist today have always existed. I mean, you look back at the muskets provided to Washington's army, and the story of Eli Whitney, and how he, I mean, if you remember that history, it's the same thing. Was he successful? Golly, Eli, you were late with the bloody muskets. Yes, but I've put together a production line, and now they're all standard, and they're interchangeable parts, so they're not each one a custom. And so they're easier to maintain, and I can produce more quickly. So the question becomes, what happens do you do, right? And the focus on implementation has been, in my opinion, too much influenced by this idea that somehow or another you can run government like a business, which I do not believe is either desirable or possible.